I've known God at a very early stage in my life, not since birth, but I think that's really shaped so much of how I see my life and my work, my relationships. And I think I don't want to lecture, I don't want to preach. What I've learned is that being vulnerable with my life will probably be the best way for you to know how God is working in and through everything, the good and the bad. Please bear with me. So the first part of this talk will be for me to share just how how God has led me to basically three main endeavors that I'm doing. The first is doctorSHARE. Basically, it's the floating hospital project that I'll share more about. The second is my family business, which is in maritime industries and hospitality. And the third thing, which is the most recent endeavor, is the Fountain Wellness, which is a reflexology massage place in Jakarta. But I think what I wanted to kind of highlight, what I've been noticing as I was reflecting on this talk, was that there's sort of this common theme that's kind of weaving through all the different endeavors that I'm doing. It starts first from my love for the Lord, and nothing will birth out of it without that love, which I appreciate Bob saying, love your God first. And that's really, I think, the first thing that I would highlight. The second theme is burden. Out of knowing God and who He is and loving Him, He's giving me those glimpses of His burden for His people. And even though you can't save the world, you can't save everybody, there is a very specific way that God does put different burdens in your heart. And I've been hearing about it from even early stage until now, and God has been pretty consistent about that theme. The third is faith-filled decisions. And when I do hear the burdens and when I identify God's burden, oftentimes it takes a huge leap of faith. It's never because it was convenient, it was never because it was easy or my choice of work, but it was so much a faith-filled decision. And the fourth thing is the theme of word, prayer, and community that has just been constantly weaving in and through every journey that I've been in. So I want to start with sharing how I actually got to know God. I was born in Jakarta, but I was not raised here. With the 98 incident, which all of you experienced in Jakarta, my family actually moved the kids all the way to Vancouver. And after Vancouver, I actually moved to Singapore, and that's where I spent 9 years of my life. I became very independent at a very early age because my parents left and lived in Jakarta, leaving me to live by myself. So I kind of got a glimpse of college independence pretty early, at an age about 14, 15. I grew up in a very secular family. We weren't really religious. My parents were Buddhist by nature, I guess, because being Chinese, you kind of inherit a lot of those Buddhist culture. But I was pretty much a free thinker. That's what I would say I am. I went to University of Michigan as my school, and that was really the first time I would say God really encountered my life. And it was really done in a very personal way, which is through community. I appreciate the session from you, Bob, because God really just showed me His love and His affection for me, helped me to identify the areas of my brokenness, and that was done so much through community. I wasn't naturally like an open person. If you know me now and know me back then, I'm a very different person. But I think what the community challenged me was that there's a lot of value in transparency and vulnerability. And that's what they showed me first, and I was able to reciprocate because they gave me that safe space to share. So I grew a lot in knowledge, faith, and just even being equipped and being part of the local church ministry. Some of you know HMCC and you're a part of that church, the Ann Arbor branch, which is the mother church, you do church like 6 days out of 7, even though you're a college student, and it's intense. It really challenges you what it means to serve, to die to yourself, even though you have obviously your priorities in school. But I think God really, really worked in my life during my time in Michigan, especially in not only just equipping me with the word, understanding and valuing ministry with people, fellowship, but also actually revealing to me more and more about His burden. So if you know Michigan, Detroit did declare bankruptcy around 2011, I believe. So I think through that and being a part of the church, I was very much shown a glimpse of God's burden for the urban poor. So there was a lot of classes that involved Detroit, and even our church planted a church in Detroit, seeing a need in that. And so just realizing there's a huge issue, social issue around homelessness. and the lack of jobs and all of that, and much of these people are very much marginalized. It's a very cyclical issue, as we know, and yet I think I was very thankful that God was giving me so many opportunities to learn more of His heart from these vehicles. The second burden that God showed me more during time in college was about the human sex trafficking industry. I never had a heart for this, to be frank. I grew up with a father who's very busy with work, and there's a lot of things that I think my mom, she shares a lot to me that has made me realize that in this day and age, you talk about sexual immoralities as being one of the biggest things you put off. And I think that is the state of where we are as a world. I think I've always looked down on women who are in that industry. In Chinese, we call it 妓女, and we just don't want to be associated with that. And yet, when my church showed the documentary of Nefarious, my heart was completely broken. If you haven't seen that documentary, it really highlights how human sex trafficking came about and what does God have to say about it. And as a woman myself, I was so ashamed that I even thought less of these women. I mean, how could any woman want to be involved in that kind of work when every person, every daughter, every child is made by God's image? And they're obviously led not through just poverty, but they're fooled to think that this is the only option that they have, or that they're just completely, obviously, trafficked by force. So God really, really broke my heart, and I think that was a beginning point for me, as the church was also very involved in this ministry, that I grew a heart for the women who are being trafficked, and just figuring out more about what is leading them to that point. And the third burden, of course, was just ministry, evangelizing and sharing the word to people that have yet to know God. And I think being part of a local church has really equipped me well to be able to share the gospel. I was a part of missions work. So I want to talk about this training program that, whether you're part of a local church or different initiatives, I think it's so valuable what God is doing through that. And even though it may be eating so much a part of your life, God is really doing something. There's nothing in God's agenda that is unintentional. So for me, even as I was able to, grow a heart for those who are lost. For me personally, I grew a lot of heart for my parents. Both my parents are not believers, and because I haven't lived with them for almost all of my life, there was not much connection, frankly. There was a lot of blaming. Why couldn't my parents be that? Why couldn't my parents be this and that, especially on my father, because he has spent so much time working. And yet God was breaking my heart more and more, not to see my dad through my own lens, but actually seeing God through his lens. And there was a lot of desire to want to share, to minister, and that definitely did not come from me, given that there were a lot of hurts also from my father on me. So those are the three big burdens that I felt God was really planting the seed in my life, even at college stage, as I was getting to know him. And then what's interesting is during my time in college, I got to be involved in an incredible project. We created Detroit Treads. I was majoring in psychology as well as art and design. Those are my two degrees. And as an artist, as a designer, I didn't really know how that would actually marry to God's purpose. But this was the first time where I got to really see how design and actually entrepreneurship can really make a difference. And we created the sandals actually for the purpose of to create employment for the homeless people. So that basically we're creating a green, sustainable product. This is basically made out of waste tires, literally from Detroit streets, and we were using even the straps from the cut seatbelt straps from all the cars that were in the junkyard. And creating this project, I think what God was planting a seed was that this is what entrepreneurship can do when you do it for the right purpose. You obviously have to be profitable, so we had a lot of discussion with the business side, but using my design to be able to do something like that was revolutionary for me. My parents are entrepreneurs, but I never thought I would be, frankly. So this was, I think, one way God was showing me that this is an area that you don't want to miss out one day. So as I was, finishing college, I went to Papua as my way to wrap up my time in school. Papua was a mission trip with my church, and it's interesting because I haven't been living in Indonesia for almost all my life, but I was able to wrap up my ministry year and my time in school in Papua, seeing a completely different side of this country, and it broke my heart. frankly, it was so eye-opening that I now got a glimpse of what's really happening in this nation. Just the poverty, the lack of infrastructure, and even though the more east you go, the more Christian it is, the more Catholic it is, it doesn't mean that they actually have a real relationship with Christ. And I think that's where God continued to build upon a burden in my heart for this country. Because frankly, I never thought I would be coming back to Indonesia, because I never lived here since I was the age of 7. But God has always intentions when He does things and when He shows you things. So I was very blessed that I got a job in New York after graduation. I guess that's like the highlight of many people's careers. Like, they want to be in New York. As a designer, to get a job there is pretty fantastic, well-paying. You know, you love what you do. It's quite the life. It's just you and New York, and everything was going well, actually. And then something happened. So I kind of want to go into how I got into doctorSHARE. About 7 months into my job, I got a phone call from my mom from Jakarta at mid-time work day, and I was like, "Mom, why are you calling me?" She was frantically crying, and she was sharing how my dad had collapsed during his work trip in Bali, and he was rushed into the ICU. You know, at this phone call, I tried to assure my mom that things would be okay. I was praying for her, even though she's not a Christian. And yet, as I was reconciling, you know, that things would be okay, my heart was not at peace. And so much of it was because I've never gotten the chance to share the gospel to my dad. And I thought, what if it was a heart attack? What if I don't have the chance anymore? And so actually with that burden, I decided to fly back, even though I used up all my leave. I like begged my boss, and he let me fly back, this time with my own money. And I was able to visit my father with the hope and intention that I would be able to share the gospel to him. And during this time, that's when actually my father had thankfully been recovering. It was not a heart attack, even though he did have a huge heart illness since a very young age. But you know, during that time when he was ill and he was just recovering in a hospital, he accidentally watched an interview on TV, which is, basically Kick Andy, for those of you Indonesians, like the Oprah equivalent here. And this guy was being interviewed, Dr. Lee Darmawan was being interviewed for the work that he has done through the building of the first floating hospital in Indonesia. So Dr. Lee was sharing about how he as a doctor, and he was giving free surgeries and medical services in remote islands of Indonesia. He discovered basically a patient one day in Gay, Maluku. So if you know where Maluku is, very close to Papua. So he was there giving free services, and one day there was basically a mother rushing with so much anxiety and just just need to save her daughter's life. Her daughter, 9 years old, Susanti, had a strangulated case of hernia. So it's basically when your intestines have been like squeezed and it's ruptured, and it was already bleeding internally. And medically, if you don't treat this within 8 hours of onset, you can actually die. But what happened was that her mother, because there were no doctors in the island where she was living in, had brought her little girl, Susanti, upon hearing that there were doctors from a nearby island, brought her girl in a little tiny boat, sailed across the ocean 3 days and 2 nights, literally just trying to find help, because she discovered that there were volunteer doctors in the nearby island. And if you know the ocean, it's not really nice, and the fact that she even made that journey was nothing short but a miracle. But the greater miracle was that Dr. Lee, not that he's the greatest doctor, but he is a good doctor, he was able to actually cure Susanti. What I do know about Dr. Lee at that point is that he is also a fellow believer, and he did pray for Susanti's miracle. The greater miracle that I would say that came out of this was that when Dr. Lee came back to Jakarta, what really burdened his heart was that if there's one case like Susanti, what about the hundreds and thousands of cases like her? Unseen and unheard. Because these are the people who are living the most remote islands in Indonesia, unheard, unseen. They want to be screaming, they want to be in pain. Nobody is serving them, nobody's listening to them. And if you're Indonesian, you know that we do have BPJS, which covers your healthcare services, but it doesn't cover your transportation cost. And because we're the largest archipelago in the world, getting to the nearest help can actually bankrupt your family, or for most often, they can't even make that trip to begin with, so they're just left suffering to die. So Dr. Lee thought about that burden which God had put in his heart, and he wasn't rich, he wasn't, young either. He was 65, I believe, at that time, and he said, "God, I don't have anything." But God burdened his heart, and that's just something that you cannot neglect. And what Dr. Lee did was he actually ended up selling a house. He had 2 homes, he sold 1 house, and he used that money to buy a wooden boat, which he then converted within 2 years of his own salary, titil, basically, to build a floating hospital, a surgical boat that would be able to sail around Indonesia's most remote island regions and save them. This really struck a chord with my father because here he was in great suffering, and he was seeing this, and he was thinking, I'm in suffering, but at least I have help. What about those people who are in suffering and yet they don't even have help? They don't even have a chance to have help. And for some reason, even though my father isn't a believer, God really did use his empathy, and he reached out to me. I don't know why, but he reached out to me and said, I've been trying to find this person. Maybe you can look him up. He's not tech savvy, so he couldn't really Google and all that. I went back to New York, and I was like, what the heck is a floating hospital? Again, I'm a graduate of art and design and psychology, nothing to do with all of this, not a doctor, not an engineer. And I actually discovered through my research Mercy Ship. And Mercy Ship is a Christian, basically medical ship, and they are sailing all around Africa, 9 months each in every port, and basically with over 200 doctors and nurses from all over the world with the same faith in the Lord, they're serving the most poor in Africa, giving people with cases of tumors like neck tumors like this, head tumors, with basically life-changing operations. I saw this, a series of videos from Mercy Ship, and I just remembered crying watching this because I can't believe that something like as big as a cruise ship would exist. And what I found out was that the doctors don't even get paid, and they have to pay to volunteer. So that's crazy for me because, as you know, being a doctor in America, for example, is extremely expensive. So why would anybody just serve like that and pay to serve? That just doesn't make sense in the world's economy. But yet, what's really interesting was that even though I was living this life in New York, and I was being intentional with my faith at work. Everybody kind of knew I was a Christian. I made that pretty known pretty early on. There was always a sort of hunger and burden in my heart to do something more in the front line. And yet I would never jeopardize my work. I would never trade it in, honestly. I would never make that decision to quit intentionally and do what was really deep inside my heart. And what's interesting is when I saw these videos, it really tugged me from my heart, and I just felt like I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be a part of what God is doing in the front line. And so right around this time, I wasn't sure if I was going to be getting the H-1B visa. For some reason, that year, there were too many people applying and too little that they were giving out. So I had a feeling, a hunch, that God may not be giving me this H-1B. In fact, there was a lot of peace for some reason, even though everybody was frantic, what, you're not going to get this? But you can't, you have to stay here. You have all this ministry in your church. But for some reason, God just gave me a lot of peace about if I don't get this visa and I have to move somewhere, there must be a reason for it. And so, true enough, I actually did not get my visa. And I actually thought, okay, this is the answer. This is where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Africa. I'm going to volunteer as a photographer. I wrote up my application, literally was about to send it in one night. And in my New York apartment, I remember just before clicking that, I prayed. And God's just planting a seed in my heart. I said, Julia, why don't you build one in Indonesia? Similar to Mercy Ship, but in Indonesia, where you're from. Then I said, no way, God. I'm way too young, inexperienced. I know nothing about maritime, medical world, or the list goes on. I justified to God that I wasn't the right person, and I have no abilities or credentials to prove that I could do this work. So I shoved it, and God wasn't done. He asked me another question, and that was through actually watching the news when Boko Haram kidnapped a lot of 200 Nigerian girls. And for some reason, God asked me this question, Julia, have you thought why you were not one of those girls? Born in Africa, Nigeria, and then kidnapped, and then you don't know where. You might be already killed. Or bring it closer to home, why weren't you born in that basically slum next to your neighborhood in Jakarta? Why weren't you born there? Have I done something like a CV to prove that I was worth the life that I was given? To say, God, look, I have a 4.0 GPA, I worked in this and this and this, therefore, I deserve to be born into 1, Indonesia, chaotic country, but still at peace. 2, a family that is entrepreneurial enough that they could afford the life that I have. And 3, have the life that I have. And then when I realized I didn't have any piece of paper to say anything to God, and yet I do have my life, I realized that there was nothing that I've earned. And for some reason, God took me further and asking me, did I give you all those things simply for you? Is it just because you love me more than all those people that are around us, poor, disenfranchised, orphan, widowed? Surely not, if we read the Bible. God loves it equally. In fact, we know that he has a huge heart for those who are orphan, poor, disenfranchised, forgotten. So I knew from that moment in prayer that God did not give me what I have for just me. It wasn't my resource to begin with. Even the family business that I was born into, even though I never thought I would be a part of it, that was intentional. That wasn't a mistake. And he gave me a vision of which I was a little girl in a playground, and I had a lot of toys with me. And, you know, right outside this playground was a gated wall with a lot of kids outside. And it was like this really straight up question. Is my God saying, Julia, just keep playing your playground. You don't have to worry about those kids outside. Or is my God saying, Julia, you take your toys, you go outside those gates, and you share those toys with those girls and those kids? And I think the answer was very clear. God is the latter. He tells me that I have to take what I have, go outside those gated walls that I live in, and share it with them. And right there in that moment, I knelt down and I said, God, I have no idea what you're asking me to do. I don't know what is a floating hospital, but if this is what you're calling me, and I am not all those things that I said I wasn't, if this does happen, it's all you, God. It is not me. And I remember saying that the glory has to all be you, because I know exactly what I'm not. And again, who am I to be building something like that? I came back to Indonesia and basically joined the family business because I thought if I need to know how to build a floating hospital, I need to know something about maritime industry. I struggled a lot with my identity, frankly. As a designer coming back from New York, you know, I could simply maybe get a job in design and do well in it. But decided to do something completely out of what I have not studied or been experienced in maritime, which is a very heavily male-dominated industry. I was working with my father, which again, there's a lot of hurt and pain. And yet, God was really revealing a lot of his burden as well for me for the workplace, which I will share more in the second part. But in when I came back to Indonesia, you know, I would say it's crazy how God times everything, to the meeting with Dr. Lee, to, you know, gathering the group of people, the volunteers who ended up chipping in their time along with me off hours to build this concept of floating hospital, and even just the fundraising process, which we realized that God did not pick a family that could just drop all the money and make it done. Because there's a lot of families who can, I believe, in Indonesia to do that. But he picked a family that couldn't do all of that in one go. So we had to be honest with ourselves, and we realized that we still needed to raise money. In US dollars is equivalent to about $1 million US. And again, all of us in the team were very inexperienced. We don't know the healthcare industry. We've never fundraised, and yet that was our task. And I can't even tell you enough the miracles and the miracles of the ways that God used this story to touch people's hearts. And it's not even my story, it's really God's story and God's heart for the people. And just to see God providing, even through our inadequacies, even through the fact that we were not the most capable experience, I would say, I guess competent in this particular area, but just the fact that we were available for God to be used. I think that was one of the key things that I learned, was just being available. And oftentimes throughout that journey of doctorSHARE, we started fundraising in 2016, and we managed to launch the floating hospital recently. Want to skim through the slides? Thanks. So this is the barge that, when I met Dr. Lee, I actually, with my father, we showed him a picture of this barge, and we said, we don't know if you may need to use it or not, but we want to donate this barge that was previously used as an accommodation barge. Basically, it's like a floating hotel for the oil riggers. But we wanted to donate this thinking that it may be used as a floating hospital. And what's really amazing was that the timing of it was so perfect that when Dr. Lee saw this boat, he immediately knew exactly where to put it. Because that same week, same month, I forgot week or month, he just felt God's leading for him to expand his operations to 2 ships. And yet he didn't have one yet when he kind of made promises to people that there will be 2. So, thanks. And yeah, Dr. Lee did really show me as well that, you know, what's really happening in Indonesia was something not to be neglected. I'm not in the medical world, but when Dr. Lee and his team allowed me to hop on the trip and see what's going on, what I realized is a huge, huge issue. I mean, we're talking about a huge issue in stunting. I think that's been a campaign that's been aggressively pushed. And in the area in Maluku particularly, 40% of children are stunted, and that's a reversible process. So you can imagine that the next generation of children are not going to be growing to their maximum capacity. You have a lot of cases of malnourishment, nearly almost 30% in Maluku. I'm sure it's equally bad in Papua, but that's what we discovered, and that's what doctorSHARE discovered. And what we were doing with doctorSHARE was, even though initially my idea and what God had planned in my mind was just build a floating hospital, but God just took me deeper and deeper and deeper to understand what is actually going on and how can this floating hospital be a blessing, be basically a symbol of hope for those people who are so much in need. So we wanted to create a model system that was unique for remote islands, something that's never been done before, something that is way out of our boundaries and thoughts in the beginning. But as God was taking us further and further and further, deeper and deeper, as you can imagine, if you were in my position, the weight was getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And there were a lot of breakdowns, frankly, a lot of tears, because you do a lot of fundraising and not everything comes back as success. So you start to question, God, am I the wrong mistake? Am I the mistake? Did you pick the wrong person? Did I, poorly lead the team? And there was so much of me, and less about what God was doing. And I think one of the things that now I'm learning as the project is now done was that God could use all of us, even the good and the bad, all our limitations. It doesn't mean that you have to have it all figured out. It's just like being a Christian. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to know the core things, and then God will take you through the rest. And that's what I really felt with this project and building the floating hospital. I just want to give you a glimpse of the renovation and the changes that we made. So this is the initial barge. It took us about 5 to 6 months to do the renovation, but 2 years of fundraising with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Thanks. So the Nusa Waliatu, which is the name of the floating hospital barge, is the first of its kind. And at the end of the day, I think what God was really reminding me, again, that it's not about me, it's about God. And when God calls, He will provide. He will be the one to enable you. And even though sometimes what He calls us is so much bigger than what you can ever imagine, because God does dream a lot bigger than we, frankly, God will be the one to always give you the miracles so that you will also have a testimony to share about His goodness, rather than our own capacities and goodness. It was a time where we felt we were failing as a team. We were supposed to launch the floating hospital around April last year, but we got delayed for a lot of reasons, including funds. We couldn't find a tugboat that would be able to help us, but God was even able to use this failure for a blessing, in which when the tsunami happened in Palu in September of last year, when I was looking at the map, I realized that the position of our floating hospital was right across the ocean from Palu. And right there and then, I knew that we weren't supposed to go to Maluku yet. We were supposed to be there to help Palu. So right there and then, we made a decision that we would sail to Palu to help with the victims of the tsunami. And that's when we went there. Sorry, I'm kind of running. That's next. So we were able to tuck the floating hospital and bring it to Palu. And we were there for about 4 months, serving the patients, giving free medical services with a lot of support from different, very generous individuals and companies, and treated over 9,000 people within 3 months. We're now in the midst of trying to transition to go to Maluku, and we're praying for a tugboat. It's always a resurrendering process. It doesn't stop just one time, but what I realize is that when you're in this kind of work, it is a marathon. And the kind of resurrendering that God is asking is enormous, because so much of all of this work is not about Julia or what she can do, or the team, but it's about what God can do, and it is His heart, and it's His story that He wants to tell. I think one particular moment that was very memorable for all of us, was actually when we heard that as we were docking at the port of Palu, we heard that there were already hundreds of people lining up and just waiting for us to kind of just sit there. And for the first day, I remember the team was so overwhelmed because there were 600 people just rushing, and that's not our capacity. We were over capacity. But actually, we found a mother who had to give birth. And this was the first baby in the first hour of us opening doors. And that was just one of the most beautiful reminders of what God can do. And even if, honestly, as I'm sharing this grand project to you, what I have to say also about doctorSHARE's journey was that it wasn't so much about the end destination. It wasn't just about the work and the floating hospital, but through all the ups and downs and the failures, God was really showing me about the process and what He was trying to make me in the process of that. So He was refining so much of my character through the failures. He was refining my identity, that it's not doctorSHARE, but I am first His. And He was reminding me about the partnership that He has given and provided through the people, and just the opportunity to get to know every single member of the team in a more intimate way, from people who don't know God to those who are Christians, to reconnecting with them and be able to help them see the hope that I have in the Lord, the vision that God has casted. And even though it's not done and it's not there, and sometimes we're not seeing the light of day, that they would be on board with the faith to see that God can work miracles. And so that journey was so invaluable. I didn't know it then, but when I look back now, it's really God just purifying my character. And I think most often we probably experience that ourselves, like when we're working on a project or when we're at our job, we think that we're achieving our targets and our KPIs, or we want to, get that promotion, or be acquired. I think for a lot of startups, but I think God is more concerned about who He's making us to be in light of that process than actually that destination. And when we know that we didn't do it all in ourselves, that's when actually we know that it's God working and not us. As I transition a bit to the family business, I need to rush a bit on that because I want to do the workshop. So the family business, again, going back to the burden, I want to touch upon actually the ministry part, because I joined the family business largely to do ministry with my father. I believe that I cannot minister to my dad if I don't know him. And it seems that he was in a very lonely world where he felt like all the weight of this work was on him. And so every time I would reach out for a prayer before I had joined the family business, it was always so irrelevant. It's like, Dad, don't stress out. Like, no, it is stressful. The work is stressful. And yet, as I was getting deeper and deeper into the work, even though I was struggling a lot with my identity and whether or not I was actually being of use for the company because of my irrelevance and studies, God did actually give me a glimpse of the different brokenness in my work. And part of it was actually a lot of things and policies were not in place, and I felt was not honoring the light of my faith. And because God is ultimately my boss, I know that He's looking at that. And if He knows that I know, I must do something about it. I can't just close my eye and pretend that I didn't know that issue. And so much about that I realized was around the human resources policies that I felt I needed to work on. And even though I didn't take HR, I wasn't experiencing that, I just felt if there was a role that I could play in this company, it would be in HRD, because everything starts with the people. So I started researching about HR, understanding HR 101, and realized that there's a lot of areas of redemption and restoration that I could do. It wasn't easy because it did mean that we have to expense more, frankly. And there was a lot of arguing with my parents about this, fighting about, should we do that, should we do this? And no, we should do it this way because of integrity, because it matters, because God is seeing it, even though they're not of faith, but to be able to share that fervently and to also follow up and execute to the best of my abilities. So I think my work in the family business and the maritime industry has always, I think, recently been challenging all these notions, all these things that have been there for a long time, but changing and restoring and redeeming the work that God has really given. The Fountain Wellness was so much about God using the burden I had that He had planted back in church, in college, which is about the human sex trafficking. I've always known that I wanted to work with women. I just didn't know when and how. And when my father, being a serial entrepreneur, just threw the idea of building something like a wellness center in Jakarta, I know that this would add more on my plate. But as I was praying about it, I believe that God was consistently pouring that seed of burden in my heart, and I was very clear that this is something that I wanted to pursue. And so I took on the idea. I said, Dad, I'll do it, and basically started from scratch, created a brand, created a vision statement, created intentional designing of the business so that we can be recruiting women from disadvantaged communities, so that we would ultimately be a platform for more women to be employed. And at the heart of it, the fountain was built for that reason. It's not so much about just building another reflexology place, but actually it was more about really building a platform to which women can be, more women, whether they're from an orphan community or from a disadvantaged community, to be able to be given skill sets and also be trained in values that do reflect Christ and be able to then have a life that is of dignity. And I think God is still in the process of teaching both me and my team on this project. There's a lot of lessons learned, but God is really faithful to use the resources that I have. Obviously, the investment doesn't come from me, but God did provide that investment through my family business, and I was able to kind of hop on that and try to redeem it so that it could be not just business, but ultimately for something that does honor God. And even as a designer, looking back, I once asked God, did I make a mistake in doing art and design? Because I'm not using any of it. But God, again, is never without intentions. And so I remember a pastor telling me, Julia, God isn't done with your story. So what makes you think that he's done? God is never going to use your art and design passion. I wanted to believe by faith that God is faithful. And so even though I'm not fully using my design abilities to do a design consulting house or whatnot, I believe that he's been allowing me to exercise my creativity and outside the box thinking to build different things like the floating hospital and even the fountain in a different perspective and light. Even raising money for doctorSHARE through a charity art auction, and that was so much birth out of actually a love and passion for art. So I think, just in closing with a bit of my story here today, I think it comes back to really knowing God, and through loving Him and drawing close to Him, that we actually have the desire to serve Him and to love what's in His heart. And I think as we talk about calling, we know that we have to make disciples of all nations, and that's something that I think our church has made pretty clear. But I think if we don't know the first commandment, the greatest commandment, which is to love God, I feel like we're really missing the huge piece. And frankly, I'm at the season of my life where, as we've already sort of concluded the project stage of the floating hospital, and I'm now engaged, there's a lot of transitions that I'm going through. And I think part of what God is teaching me is to quiet myself down again, to remember who am I before Him. It's not so much my achievements, because there was a lot of anxiety and insecurity, also feeling like, what if I'm not able to continue doing the great things? And right now that I'm not doing the floating hospital project and my role has changed, and I'm not as involved in the family business in the marketing line, there was a lot of insecurities about, have I done enough, God? Can I do more? And you were saying, Rob, can I do more? Am I not doing enough? But it's interesting that, God, in the cycle of our life and our career, God always is most concerned about our love for Him. And if we're forgetting that, He will do whatever He can to bring us back to that place where we will be loving Him again. Because at the end of the day, all the burdens that I shared to you, from the urban poor, those who are forgotten and left afar in Indonesia, to the human sex trafficking community, those came out of a love for God. It wasn't coming from Julia, but it was coming from the love of God. And so if I don't even have that, I can't even be doing all this work. And I just want to emphasize community as well, because I didn't get here on my own. So much of the consistency and the accountability, the prayer came from people who are most close to me and just reminding me that, Julia, God did not make a mistake when He chose you, and it is a privilege to be used by Him. And I think oftentimes when we get busy with our work, I find myself also very similarly. The first time we miss life group, the first time we miss church, we feel really bad. The second time we feel bad, but over time we feel like we've gone to a place where we're like, okay, we don't really need this. And I think this is a reminder for myself, because I do travel a bit for my work, but that God does emphasize community in light of word and prayer in the midst of our calling as a Christian, and that should not be neglected. So again, I think coming back to really the theme that I shared to you is about loving God, and from knowing Him, you know what it means to love others, which is sharing the burden with God, and actually at the end of the day, making faith-filled decisions, not your own decisions, not out of convenience, but faith-filled decisions. And yeah, just surrounding yourself with word, prayer, and community on repeat. That is on repeat. With that, I want to conclude my testimony. And hopefully, even though not all of you are in family businesses, I think that we all have a role and calling to be serving in whatever capacities and influence that we have, be it in the small ways. It could mean just being intentional with your time to minister to your colleagues, or grabbing lunch for the purpose of sharing the gospel in your life as is, not taking the word and vocabularies of Christ, Jesus, faith out of the picture, but involving that in your discussion. And I find that to be the most effective way of ministering. Just being who you are, being exactly who you are Sunday, Monday, all the way 7 days a week, that you don't take any part of your life out of the picture. And of course, there's sensitivity to that in work, but I think when people just see who you are as candidly, they get to see a glimpse of God the best way. I want to do a quick workshop. I think all of you have a piece of paper. You should have a piece of paper. And everybody should have 4 Post-it note colors. I want to give credit to Catherine Olsoff. She's the co-writer of Every Good Endeavor. She was the one who conducted this workshop for us back in Resource Global's first cohort meeting, which was in Menlo Park. And I was just so thankful that she did this with us, because oftentimes, when we're going through the grunt and work, and we don't realize sometimes the way God is actually at work within our lives through the perspective of career. So this workshop will just help you to be able to just evaluate and see more effectively how God is just there and present at your work. And hopefully from the discussions later, you'll be able to see different patterns and themes that God is working in your life. So the first thing that I want is, with your A3 paper, keep it horizontal. And with one sheet of paper, I want you to write basically all the careers and job positions that you've remembered, and put it from left side, like stick it on the top, from the left side being the most recent, and then on your right, the most old job that you had. Just the ones that you remembered that was very distinct. Write the position title and the company title. So use one Post-it color to write that. Use blue, for example. Yeah. Again, left side top corner is the most recent. So for me, for example, it's the Fountain Wellness CEO, for example. And then it could be also a nonprofit that you're a part of. It doesn't mean it's just your formal job. It could be different positions you've had. Just go on the line, basically. For those of you who have worked longer, I'm sure it'll be a lot longer of a list. But if you want to just keep it to the ones that are most distinctive, you can as well. Yep. No, one Post-it for one job. Sorry, I needed to clarify. One Post-it for one job. So if you have an A3, there should be like multiple Post-its. One job, one Post-it. Okay? Once you're done with that, I want you to take the yellow Post-its, and for every job that you have, so go now, not horizontal, but go down for every job now. Under that Post-it of your job positions, use the yellow Post-its to write all the positive tasks, accolades, awards, positive people that have been an influence in a positive way, all the positive things that you can think about. And write it down on below, basically, the position of the job that you held. I'll give you 5 minutes for that. Again, positive tasks, awards, achievements. It could be a praise from your boss. It could be, that time when you won a fundraising, or when you were praised for a work that you did. It could be a boss that you really respected. So it could be an individual's name as well. So any positives. And write it for every job that you have put on the top. I guess you might remember more in the beginning one, from the most recent one, so you don't maybe have to go too much into the end, but make time to just stick it under the job title.